Okay, I had somebody email me recently to ask me questions about research that I had done 25 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, on what I call the actual matrix plan. And my response was that my focus is on what is the response from Mother Nature, as Mother Nature takes revenge against the actual matrix plan. And as I presented the evidence for this revenge by Mother Nature, the person never engaged with the evidence. Instead, they said that I had an apocalyptic outlook, a quote unquote apocalyptic outlook, and that I should realize that academia is corrupt and that I have chosen the wrong story. So those were the three terms: story, and before they had called it a narrative, they said I had the wrong narrative, and that it was an apocalyptic outlook and based on corrupt academia. Now, this is kind of ironic because that's the standard, big oil propaganda response, is that the global warming scientists are corrupt because they're in it for the money, big government grants. And of course, first of all, the grants are not big money compared to what big oil makes and gets subsidized. Secondly, the grants go to fund the equipment, the research equipment, and the research assistants, the students, and so nobody's profiting. They're not accumulating wealth from the grant money. And now you could easily say that, well, all of science is corrupt. I mean, all of it, and I understand that. But my response was, well, science is like the deer in the headlights. This scientists, they can document the acceleration of the ecological crisis, but they can't do anything about it. And so they're like deer in the headlights. And the internet is the medium of the message. And so, the greatest rate of electrical increase is from cell phones of people using the internet. And so you could say that all of science is corrupt, but that doesn't mean that the ecological crisis isn't real. And in fact, it's much worse than even the most climate scientists realize. And so one of the standard claims by climate scientists is that if we stop all CO2 emissions, then the atmospheric temperature will actually go down because the oceans will keep absorbing more CO2. But I just got a response from Jim Massa, who's a PhD oceanographer living in Alaska and focused on global warming research, because the oceans are what it is driving global warming. And I asked him to debunk this claim that is constantly, or it's if you study global warming, you will inevitably hear this claim that if we stopped all CO2 emissions, then the oceans would keep absorbing more CO2, and therefore the atmospheric temperature would go down. But Jim Massa did indeed debunk that claim, because he pointed out that as you increase the CO2 saturation in the oceans, then it can't absorb. Essentially, it's absorbed as much CO2 as possible, and it changes the absorption rate. I can post the quote from Jim Massa. It was basically just one sentence reply, but he's been documenting how the oceans have become stratified, so they're not mixing. They're supposed to be mixing through the cycling. And there's about 500 zettajoules of extra heat in the oceans that is accumulated since 1995. So it's over 90% of the global warming heat that's stored up in the oceans. And the increase in atmospheric temperature over the past 10,000 years due to humans has only been 30 zettajoules, around 30, maybe a little more now. So obviously 500 zettajoules is a lot more than 30 zettajoules. And so that ocean heat is now starting to release back in the atmosphere, and that's what the El Nino has been doing. And so that's one big claim that is actually much worse than what even the global warming scientists, like the most famous one, Michael Mann, who's constantly quoted in the corporate state media. And it's great that he's doing his thing. He's a global warming scientist, so he's taking a lot of flack, a lot of heat for that. So that's good that he's sticking to it, but he is wrong to claim that the Earth's temperature will go down, the atmosphere, if we stopped all CO2 emissions. And of course, we're not stopping emissions were increasing emissions at probably, I would think, at an accelerating rate. the heat is accelerating, and so there's this huge disconnect between what people know about global warming from the little snippets they get on TV, and then what people think is actual global warming science. They just had an op-ed in the corporate state media today how John Clauser, who won the Nobel Prize in 2022, I think it was, or maybe it's 2023. Anyway, for similar research that my own quantum physics professor worked on, and Herbert J. Bernstein. So they, Clauser, he tried to claim that clouds are cooling the Earth overall, but Michael Mann said no, that's not true. They're proven to be heating up the Earth overall. And this claim that clouds are cooling the Earth, well, that's what's called the aerosol masking effect. And so it depends on the elevation of the clouds and the type of cloud, whether it's cooling or heating up the Earth. But the aerosol masking effect is twice as bad as previously thought. And Daniel Rosenfeld did that research, his research group. And he's cited in the IPCC, Daniel Rosenfeld, but they kind of brush it off and they say that, well, if methane emissions go down, then that will offset the temperature increase from reducing burning coal that has been cooling the planet due to the aerosol masking effect. So they try to couple this reduction of methane to balance out the reduction of coal burning that would actually heat up Earth by reducing the sulfur particulates, because the sulfur particulates have been cooling the Earth as the aerosol masking effect. So the problem with this claim is that the methane keeps going up to the point now where the natural methane has now been triggered out of the world's largest ocean shelf, which is the reserve of pressurized methane of 1,200 gigatons. And so just a 5 gigaton abrupt eruption will double the atmospheric temperature. And so the IPCC literally dismisses this East Siberian Arctic Shelf pressurized methane and tries to claim that it's not an immediate threat, that, if it happened, it would happen like slowly and over hundreds of years. But that's totally not accurate. And so the Julia Steinbach paper in 2021 was in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, and she was citing Natalia Shakova. And Natalia Shakova worked directly with Jim Massa. And so Jim Massa has vouched for Natalia Shakova as being a legitimate, very good researcher. And she's not corrupt. She's contrary to the claim of the prominent independent researcher who emailed me with questions, and she didn't like my answers because I wasn't telling her what she wanted to hear, apparently. So we know now the Arctic is melting 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, or it's heating up 4 times faster. The Arctic ice is melting from underneath, from the ocean temperature being so hot. So what they call the heat blobs, especially like the Mediterranean hot ocean. And then I just learned, well, when they decreased the aerosol particulates from the diesel cargo ships in the North Atlantic, that caused the Northern Africa to have drought, and like Algeria and Morocco and so then basically the drought is much worse than people realize. So the Panama Canal is only working at 40% capacity for cargo ships because it relies on fresh water from a rain-fed lake. And in the rainforest, you're supposed to have a lot of rain, but they've, because they have drought, and the equatorial rainforest in the Amazon, which I guess is the largest in the world, and that's had serious drought. And the dolphins are not surviving, the freshwater dolphins. They're pink. The Horn of Africa had drought for 7 out of the 8 rainy seasons, and then the 9th rainy season they got flash floods that displaced like 700,000 people. And so overall, you can't really farm in those kind of conditions. I don't know if they can farm after the flash flood or not. Like, how is that going to work? But they had 20 million people in a food emergency, and there's something like another 10 million people in the Congo that are displaced due to war. And of course, a lot of these wars are from just like plundering resources and competing for resources. And so the drought has been really bad in the US for the farmers, and it's been really bad in China for the farmers there. So the food supply is directly threatened. Like, India stopped exporting I think it was basmati rice, and that's that's a big deal. Anyway, there's like climate scientists, they'll talk about the ocean levels rising, which is a big problem right now if you live on an island in the Pacific. But the coastal cities are basically like, well, we can build huge walls as flood protection, or there's this mentality that we can just separate ourselves from ecology and the need for habitat. And the problem is that most people grew up in cities, and it's what farmers call cityates. They call them cityates. And so you, I think there's a fancy word in cultural studies. It's called habitus by Pierre Bourdieu or something. He's like a French philosopher. But the basic idea of habitus is that it's experiential knowledge. And so if you lack the experience, you have a psychological blockage or repression. And so you'll be in denial of the fact that humans, when push comes to shove, we're just like any other animal. We rely on habitat. So instead, people will think, well, we can just grow food from aquaculture or aquaponics or hydroponics or whatever. We can grow food, in laboratories or, have synthetic ecology. We can live in outer space with synthetic ecology. And that was actually promoted on what Greg Palast, the journalist, calls National Petroleum Radio on Science Fridays. It was a few years ago. I heard the segment where they're talking about NASA having synthetic ecology, so people can live in outer space. So it's kind of like, well, the Biosphere 2 actually failed in Arizona, where they tried to close themselves off from the environment. So they had to create their own oxygen, and they weren't able to do it because it's and so basically, and another idea is, well, we can invest in tree planting, reforestation, but we forget that we've been harvesting the photosynthesis energy from over tens of millions of years, like hundreds of millions of years of stored up photosynthesis energy that was primarily ocean algae, so the algae became oil. That's the main source of the oil. And so even if we planted like 2 trillion trees, that would only offset 1 year of emissions, and in no way would it reduce the CO2. It wouldn't stop any increase of CO2 after 1 year. So it's like literally impossible to offset the emissions. We could grow algae, at scale, like they did. Like instead of like growing trees, we could grow algae in the desert and store carbon, with the algae storing the carbon through photosynthesis. And that's the original, just how it was originally, like how oil was made. So of course, the problem is that you have essentially 2,000 years of science so we've had this infrastructure where everything is based on burning coal and oil and, gasoline, and then we have the aerosol masking effect. And this is what conservation biologist Guy McPherson calls the McPherson paradox. So if we stopped all CO2 emissions, the immediate effect, because of the lack of sulfur particulates from burning coal, it would heat up Earth. If we did a 40% reduction in burning coal, it actually will heat up the planet another 1 degree Celsius global average. And that's because the aerosol masking effect is twice as bad as previously thought. And so based on the aerosol masking effect, we are already over 2 degrees Celsius planetary temperature increase. We've already stopped the next ice age from happening, which most people, they could care less about that. But the problem is that there's been ice ages going on for 800,000 years, and the CO2 emissions are already beyond what they were 3 million years ago. I think it's around like 6 million years ago now. I think it's like in the Miocene era. So that, in other words, the Arctic is about to go ice free, and the temperature will be higher than it was 3 million years ago. So the immediate concern is basic resources like the growing food when there's drought, and you can't just move farming to farther north because you need the habitat of the soil. And so then people are like, well, if we become vegetarian, then we will stop all the emissions of the methane and nitrous oxide from ruminants digesting grass, so like cattle and sheep and stuff like that. But the problem with that claim is that normally, though, ruminants, they actually store carbon, and that's how the deep soil was created, was from 50 million bison. So the animals aren't the cause of the global warming, it's rather how they're managed. And so there's this practice called regenerative agriculture that I have participated in, I've helped out on. And the farm I helped out on was even featured for the signing of the new farm bill for Minnesota. And that farm has been proven to store carbon by having livestock. So this claim that we have to be vegetarian. The other problem with and I was vegetarian for, I don't know, 20 years, from high school till 2001, so 80, yeah, like at least 15 years. So then the other claim that, the problem with vegetable farming is that, commodity crops, that is vegetarian farming. So it's like the vegetarians, they think of farming as a consumer-driven market, but that's not how farming works. Farming is a commodity subsidized market. And so the farmers, they grow corn and they grow soybeans primarily, and wheat. And the corn and the soybeans it's 100% vegetarian. It's vegan, but it's destroying the environment because it's all petrochemical, synthetic based fertilizer and diesel operated machinery, whether it's trucks or tractors or, so they have a huge chemical CO2 emission rate, and then the corn is field corn, and it's used to feed livestock, and the same with the soybeans. It's used to feed either chickens or hogs, and so basically vegetarian farming is just, it's as much of a problem as the vegetarian, having a vegetarian diet you'd have to change the type of vegetarian farming because we already have vegetarian farming. So so the of course farming has also been relying on deforestation since farming developed 10,000 years ago. And at first, when you burn, the farmers, they usually just burn the forest to clear the land, which is obviously, I mean, you can create fertile soil from the ash, but and it turns out the smoke, the sulfur in the smoke, then the particulates, that the soot will cool the earth, as the aerosol mass effect. So even though we were heating up the earth from CO2, from farming, from methane, and we were also cooling the earth from the particulates. And so it balanced out almost until the end of the 1970s. And then pretty much after the 1950s, the global warming started to take over, but it was really not until the end of the 1970s when everything just skyrocketed, because you had globalization, and so you had China and India being westernized with cars, and so anyway, the CO2 emission rate is 100 times faster than any previous time in the last 500 million years on the planet. And even Joseph Fourier understood 200 years ago. He published research that the, quote, dark heat would heat up the planet through, quote, effects of human industry, end quote. So Joseph Fourier, who created the Fourier analysis that most scientists use, he already understood global warming 200 years ago. And so Raymond Pierre Humbert, who's a physics professor, and David Archer, they published a book of the primary global warming science papers that were published, and Joseph Fourier is the first paper. So I've actually read Joseph Fourier's global warming paper. And then there's Svante Arrhenius, who by the 1890s had realized that the CO2 emissions of industry would heat up Earth about 1 degree Celsius by, I think it was like 2000 or something. I haven't read his paper, but so the actual physics of global warming is based on the frequency of the photons as entropy. And this actually gets you into quantum biology, which is a whole other level of global warming. But essentially, as Raymond Pierre Humbert points out, as you increase the CO2 level, it actually broadens the frequency bandwidth that absorbs the CO2. And so that's why you don't have any saturation of the CO2 global warming effect. It just keeps increasing as you add more CO2. And so Raymond Pierre Humbert, he emphasizes that if we try to do any kind of albedo modification, then that will just cause terminal shock. And so what's happening now is you're getting a lot of so-called, global warming scientists who are calling for geoengineering or albedo modification that they call solar radiation management. And there's various types of it. But as Raymond Pierre Humbert points out, any kind of albedo modification, for it to be effective, has to be done all or nothing. So it has to be done at scale for the whole planet. And then to be maintained, if you do that at scale, the effort required would then distract from addressing the cause of the problem, which is the CO2 emissions that keep increasing. And so if we increase the CO2 emissions at the same rate that it would take to actually implement the solar radiation management, then we would have to maintain that solar radiation management nonstop for 10,000 years, because the carbon cycle is a 10,000 year cycle on the planet, based on how long CO2 stays in the atmosphere and then how long it's absorbed and emitted from the oceans. And so if there was any kind of problem in 10,000 years with this solar radiation management, then it would immediately plunge the planet into terminal shock, what Raymond Pierre Humbert calls terminal shock, which means you'd have an immediate temperature increase so much that the habitat for life would shut down photosynthesis for plants, because the plants, they start having problems with photosynthesis, and then it stops at 104 degrees. And the interior of the continents is 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the rest of the planet on average. And that's where all the food is grown at scale, is in the interior of the continents, the breadbaskets, so-called. And so essentially, any kind of albedo modification would actually make the problem worse, because as long as the cause of the problem is not addressed, then it's a 10,000 year problem for the planet. And so this creates basically like a triple whammy. So you can't do solar radiation management, you can't stop burning coal because of the aerosol masking effect, and so renewable energy won't work. You can't absorb enough CO2, you can't reduce enough by growing trees. You could maybe do algae, but then you'd also have to completely transform industrial civilization that continues to increase CO2 emissions, and the main conference that's supposed to be reducing CO2 is now being led by an oil company that wants to increase CO2 even more. And so everything, the the largest emitter of CO2 is the U.S. military, and that keeps growing every year. And so there's absolutely there's no feasible way, because the other thing is that the methane level coming out of the world's largest ocean shelf is at a higher rate of methane than the rest of the world's oceans combined. So it's already been triggered, what they call the methane clathrate gun has been triggered. And so that will keep accelerating out of the ocean into the atmosphere from the East Siberian Arctic shelf. And of course, we saw the huge wildfires in Canada that kept getting worse. Now, for me personally, I was right out of high school. When I was in high school, I already became focused on environmental activism, and that was my first full-time job out of high school. And I don't know, I guess I'm just strange. Like I'm a weirdo, because I grew up in the city, but I actually spent every day in a wild nature environment that was right across my street. So I got lucky. I saw it being destroyed by the city. So for whatever reason, So when I saw that, I realized, and then I heard about, I think it was Sting, protecting the rainforest. Then I read Winona LaDuke in the Northern Sun Press, which was a free activist newspaper at the library. And so I kept doing environmental activism, and I researched it more and more. And by 1996, I realized we were doomed. Like literally, I knew we were doomed no matter what. And since we were doomed no matter what, I knew there was no point in telling anybody this, because it wouldn't help anything. Because nobody wants to hear we're doomed, and nobody can do anything about it anyway. So then logically, I decided to learn what happens after death. And so I finished my master's degree by training in non-Western meditation through the African Studies Department at the University of Minnesota. And I trained with a Taoist yoga master. And I fasted for 8 days, but my energy kept increasing. And I had an enlightenment experience, and I opened up my third eye, and I saw ghosts for real, like real ghosts that came in from the woods at a retreat center, at a Christian retreat center, where the Qigong master was in full lotus meditation, and these yellow lights shaped like humans floated in and were hovering around the Qigong master. And he said that, I didn't say anything to anybody about this, but he said, well, since somebody can see this, I will explain what's happening. And he said that he regularly heals people who are no longer alive, who are, ghosts or spirits or whatever word he used. And I had recently read a book that I got through interlibrary loan about the most famous Buddhist meditation master of Thailand, and his name is Fra Archan Moon. And anybody can read his book now. It's free online. And so the biography of Fra Archan Moon, he also describes healing ghosts, that the ghosts would come to him to get healed. So that didn't, I was surprised. I was surprised to see this, but I saw other things and I had other experiences, and I permanently rewired my physiology, and I realized that modern left brain dominant humans using right hand dominant tools and technology are literally brainwashed, like mind controlled. And that's happened since we developed farming and written language. And so that's why there's this deep denial about global warming, because there's literally a disconnect from nature as a living reality of matter as alive. Matter is alive because all of matter is made of photons as spirit, and then that's what creates life. And this was discovered in quantum physics. It's in 1945. Erwin Schrödinger published a book called What is Life? And he said that life is from quantum negative entropy. And so I'm not going to go into that right now. I've written papers about it, So I then spent 10 years reading one scholarly book a day for 10 years while I worked part-time at a environmental nonprofit. And people wondered what I was doing. They're like, well, are you moonlighting? Do you have another job? So I found the cheapest place I could find to rent. So I shared a bathroom and it had no kitchen. And then I dumpster dived for food. And I knew the economy was going to crash because it was based on speculative finance. Since the 1970s, the investment had switched over to being primarily speculative, like derivatives and financial wealth. So I knew it was going to crash. I knew the housing market was going to crash. And I figured if people saw me in Minneapolis hanging out of a dumpster eating food, then when they have to go on food stamps, they would think, well, it's not as bad as that guy. That guy had it, eating out of a dumpster. And sure enough, the food stamp use did double. And then that's basically it. I got into regenerative agriculture after that, and I bought, land in northern Minnesota, which is the coldest place in the lower 48, one of the coldest places by far. And it's already heating up. It's already 2 degrees warmer than the global average in northern Minnesota. And I don't plan on needing, much survival. I think that the droughts are going to keep getting worse. The extreme weather will keep getting worse. The global warming scientists are saying El Nino will keep getting worse next year. So we can expect even worse wildfires, even worse drought, even worse flash floods. And like I said, I knew we were doomed by 1996. So for me, I haven't had any denial. When I first learned about Guy McPherson coming out about the McPherson paradox of the aerosol masking effect and abrupt global warming, I wasn't surprised at all. And I said, well, finally, some academic is coming out and saying it. And that was in 2017, I think. And then, of course, he got he got targeted for that. He got attacked by the deep psychological denial. There's a really deep psychological denial in Western civilization, or just modern patriarchy, um, from farming culture worldwide. You find this, and it just got Professor R. Brian Ferguson's book on chimpanzees, war, and history. And it's really debunking the claim that humans are inherently warlike. But all of his research is basically, he argues, war is a byproduct of hierarchical cultures that have hoarded wealth based on patriarchy from farming, so in the last 10,000 years. And humans have been around for over 200,000 years. And music was the core key of all human cultures. And our original human culture required all the males to train in spiritual healing through music and dancing. And this training was called Teshoma, and it was based on the female num energy. So it was directly a female energy healing. And most of nature is female. And for males, we provide some DNA variety, but we're not needed. So in nature, it's called parthenogenesis, where the females can self-reproduce. But you find this is the norm for, for bacteria and like other kinds, like most of life is bacteria, like in the soil. So that's why there's this deep denial, because it has to do with male primate physiology as mind control, as left brain dominance and right hand tool use. And so I wrote a book about this in 2012 called Alchemy of Rainbow Heart Music. And I wrote it because I received a book contract by the Trine Day publisher, Chris Milligan. But my book was just a wide array of, freewheeling, interdisciplinary, widely casted investigation. So I didn't pursue getting it published, and he was facing lawsuits and trying to pay debt and all that. So, but that book's been free online. He did offer to actually publish it again, like 10 years later. But I said, just try to get your debt paid off. I mean, nobody reads books hardly anyway. We're all on the internet now, trying to keep up with the accelerating destruction of the real world, the ecology. And what I find fascinating is all the physicists who they don't even talk about, the geophysics, the destruction of the biosphere. And so now the op-ed today, I think I mentioned, was John Clauser, who's a Nobel physicist, but he doesn't have any published research in climate science. And then he tried to claim that clouds were cooling the earth, and then which was wrong overall. And then I had a debate with another physicist, Jack Sarfati, and he said how he worked with John Clauser, and then he also said, well, I don't know if global warming is real. And I'm like, well, you realize there was a Nobel Prize for global warming science in 2021. And then he's like, well, if it is real, I think we're doomed. And I'm like, yeah, we are doomed. And so So that's basically it. So you have all these people who are claiming that it's just a story, that it's an outlook, that the doom outlook, the apocalyptic outlook, is a story but it's actually based on empirical evidence, and it's happening. It's happening right now. It's accelerating. And so unless you're living off the land, which most people aren't, like probably 99% of people on the planet are not living off the land anymore, then you're not going to really be aware of how bad things are. We, like where I live, we've had drought the past 3 years, but most people here, they just think, well, it's just a natural variation and the drought's going to stop, and they don't realize that the drought is actually going to keep accelerating. It has to, because of, the global warming physics that was first published 200 years ago. So it's been fun to be an environmental activist, but most environmental activists are they're murdered or assassinated or murdered. And I don't want to be a martyr. So I just think Mother Nature she will finish the job. As Jim Massa said recently, the oceanographer, he said that the planet will breathe a deep sigh of relief. After the biological annihilation of life on Earth, and it might take like 10 million years for the planet to recover, but we will all be ghosts, and who knows if we'll get reincarnated or whatever, rebirthed into physical matter on Earth. If we do, we're going to be like in bizarre mutations from the radiation and stuff. And so I guess, the goal is to try to decrease the suffering and the damage, the rate of damage. Like try to have a soft landing. That's the goal. And hopefully we can do that. We can have a soft landing into the cosmic mother of the universe. And that's all I'm going to say. I've ranted for an hour. And that's my abrupt global warming update.